In the shadow of Montana's Copper Ridge Mountains, 64-year-old Everett Sloan had built a fortress of solitude around his sprawling ranch. For 10 years, the millionaire cattle baron had lived alone in his log mansion, his heart as cold as the mountain streams that cut through his 20,000 acres. The townspeople whispered that grief had turned him to stone after that terrible barn fire claimed his wife and twin boys. But on this particular April evening, riding home from the spring auction with a trailer full of prize Angus, Everett would discover something that would crack open the walls he'd built around his wounded soul. What would a man who'd sworn off human connection do when he found a bleeding stranger and her injured dog seeking shelter in his home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rutted gravel road that led to Everett Sloan's ranch stretched for 8 miles from the main highway, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen that had witnessed a century of Montana seasons. As his heavy-duty pickup truck climbed the final ridge, the cattle trailer swaying behind him with its cargo of prize Angus bulls, Everett could see the valley that had been his kingdom and his prison for the past decade. 20,000 acres of prime grazing land spread before him like a green carpet dotted with black cattle. The Clark Fork River meandered through the heart of his property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that would soon burst into their spring green. To the east, the Copper Ridge Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks still crowned with snow that would feed the streams through the long summer months. And at the center of it all stood his log mansion, a structure that had once been filled with laughter and music, now as silent as a tomb. Everett guided the truck down the winding drive, past the wooden sign that read, Sloan Ranch, Est, 1952, in faded letters his grandfather had carved by hand. The old man would hardly recognize what the place had become. Where once there had been a working ranch with hired hands and seasonal workers, now there was only Everett and the automated systems that fed his cattle and monitored his fences. Technology had made it possible for one man to run an operation that once required a dozen, but it had also made it possible for one man to disappear entirely from the world of human connection. The house loomed before him as he parked near the covered porch, its hand-hewn logs dark with age and weathering. It had been built in stages over 3 generations, starting with his great-grandfather's modest cabin and expanding as the family prospered. The original structure now formed the kitchen and great room, while wings had been added for bedrooms, a library, and what had once been a music room. Every addition told the story of a family that expected to grow, to fill the spaces with children and grandchildren, in the comfortable chaos of a life fully lived. But that life had ended on an October night 10 years ago, when a faulty electrical wire in the old barn had sparked a fire that moved faster than any man could run. Everett shut off the engine and sat for a moment in the gathering dusk, listening to the familiar sounds of his isolated world. Cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through the pines, the trickle of water over stones in the creek that ran behind the house. These were the only voices he heard most days, and he had convinced himself they were enough. He had been a different man then, before the fire. Harold Everett Sloan had inherited his grandfather's business sense and his father's love of the land. But from his mother, he had gotten something rarer, a capacity for joy that had made him beloved in the community. He and Sarah had been the couple everyone pointed to as proof that true love existed. High school sweethearts who had grown more devoted with each passing year. When the twins, Michael and James, arrived after years of hoping and praying, it seemed their happiness was complete. Sarah had been the heart of their home, a woman who could gentle a spooked horse with her voice and coax music from the old pump, organ that had belonged to her grandmother. She taught piano lessons to the children in town, turning their front parlor into an informal music school where young voices lifted in harmony on Saturday mornings. Michael had inherited her musical gift, already picking out melodies on the piano at age 7, while James preferred the harmonica that his father had taught him to play. The memory of those Saturday mornings could still stop Everett cold if he let it. Sarah at the organ, her red hair catching the light from the tall windows. The boys gathered around her, their voices blending in the old hymns she loved. And him in his chair by the fire, reading the stock reports, but really listening to the music that made their house a home. On that terrible October night, he had been in Denver on business, closing a deal for a new breeding program that would have secured their future for generations. The call had come at 3 in the morning, the sheriff's voice careful and official over the phone. "There's been a fire, Everett. I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry." He had driven through the night, pushing his truck beyond all reasonable limits, but arrived to find only smoking ruins where the barn had stood. The house was untouched, but the barn where Sarah had gone to check on Amare and Foal, where the boys had followed her despite being told to stay inside, was nothing but charred timber and ashdot. They told him later that an electrical short in the old wiring had started it. The barn had been built in the 1960s, before modern safety codes, and the wiring should have been replaced years ago. It was one of those things he had meant to get around to, one of those projects that got pushed aside for more pressing concerns. The kind of oversight that seems insignificant until it becomes the thing that destroys everything you love. The funerals had been held in the same church where he and Sarah had been married, where the boys had been baptized. Half the county had come to pay their respects, filling the pews and spilling out into the parking lot. Everyone had a story about Sarah's kindness, about the boys' bright spirits, about the music that had made the Sloan house a gathering place for friends and neighbors. But Everett had heard none of it. He had sat in the front pew, as cold and still as the mountains outside, feeling nothing but the terrible weight of absence. The preacher had spoken of God's plan and the mystery of suffering, but Everett had heard only the silence where Sarah's voice should have been, the emptiness where his son's laughter had once filled every corner of his world. After the burial, the neighbors had brought food and offered comfort, but Everett had retreated into his house like a wounded animal seeking its den. He had disconnected the phone, stopped answering the door, and allowed the dust to settle over the pump organ until its voice was as silent as everything else in his world. The ranch work had saved him, in a way. Cattle needed to be fed regardless of personal tragedy, and the mindless routine of checking fence lines and monitoring water sources had given structure to his shattered days. But as months turned to years, the isolation that had begun as a necessity for survival had become his chosen way of life. He had modernized everything, installing automated feeding systems and electronic monitoring that allowed him to run the operation with minimal human contact. His business was conducted by phone and email, his supplies delivered by truck drivers who knew better than to linger for conversation. The fortune he had built through careful breeding and land acquisition had grown even larger in his isolation, fed by his complete focus on profit and his indifference to personal comfort. The people of Copper Ridge had gradually stopped trying to draw him back into the community. They understood grief, but 10 years was a long time to mourn, and his continued rejection of their overtures had eventually hardened into a mutual avoidance. They respected his privacy and his property lines, and he provided employment and economic stability to the region through his business dealings. It was a cold arrangement, but it worked out now. As he climbed down from his truck and began the familiar routine of unhitching the trailer, Everett told himself he was content with this life. The cattle in the trailer lowed softly as they sensed the end of their journey, and he moved among them with the efficient competence of a man who had spent his entire adult life working with livestock. These were good animals, the product of careful breeding and selection, and they would improve his herd's genetics for generations to come. But as he opened the gate to the holding pen and began unloading the bulls, something felt different about this evening. The air carried a strange tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm when even the cattle grow restless. The horses in the near pasture were bunched together, their heads high and ears pricked toward the house. Everett paused in his work, scanning the familiar landscape for anything out of place. Nothing moved except the gentle sway of grass in the evening breeze. But his instincts, honed by years of reading, weather and livestock, and the subtle signs of trouble on the range, told him something was wrong. The bull safely penned, he walked toward the house, his boots echoing on the wooden steps of the porch. The front door was unlocked, as it always was. Crime was rare in this remote valley, and there was little point in locking doors when the nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. But as he stepped into the great room, Everett stopped dead in his tracks. There, flickering on the mantel, where it hadn't been when he left that morning, was an old storm lantern casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Someone was in his house. Everett's hand moved instinctively to the rifle rack beside the door, but he stopped himself. The lantern's flame burned steady and calm, not the frantic flicker of someone trying to hide. Whoever had lit it wanted to be seen, or perhaps was. Too exhausted to care about concealment, he moved through his house with the careful steps of a man who knew every creaking board, following the amber glow toward the great room's massive stone fireplace. The storm lantern sat on the mantel like a beacon, its brass base reflecting the last rays of sunlight that slanted through the tall windows. But it wasn't the lantern that made Everett's breath catch in his throat. Curled on the hearth rug before the cold fireplace lay a young woman and a medium-sized dog, both so still he thought for a moment they might be dead. The woman's dark hair was matted with what looked like dried blood, and her clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt that had once been blue were torn and stained with mud and something darker. Her arm was wrapped protectively around the dog, a border collie mix whose black and white coat was dulled with dirt and whose left hind paw was held at an awkward angle. The dog's head lifted as Everett approached, brown eyes alert despite obvious exhaustion. A low rumble started in the animal's chest. Not quite a growl, but a clear warning that he would defend his companion with whatever strength remained to him. "Easy, boy," Everett whispered, crouching slowly several feet away. "Easy now." The woman stirred at the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal green eyes that were clouded with pain and fear. For a moment she stared at him without comprehension. Then consciousness flooded back, and she struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at injuries Everett couldn't yet see. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't call the sheriff. I know I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know where else to go." The dog had moved to a sitting position beside her, still watching Everett with wary intelligence. The animal was clearly in pain. His left rear leg wouldn't bear weight, but his focus remained entirely on protecting the woman. Everett studied them both, his mind cataloging details with the practical efficiency that had made him successful in business. The woman was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of understudied beauty that suggested she'd been raised to value substance over appearance. Her hands, though scratched and dirty, showed the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. The wedding ring on her left hand caught the lantern light, but it hung loose on her finger as if she'd lost weight recently. The dog wore a leather collar, well made but worn, with a brass nameplate that read Scout. His breed suggested intelligence and loyalty, and the way he positioned himself between the woman and Everett confirmed both traits. "How long have you been here?" Everett asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Since this morning, I think." "Maybe yesterday. Time gets fuzzy when you're running." She attempted to shift position and gasped, pressing her hand to her left side. "I'm sorry about breaking in. The door was unlocked, and it was so cold last night. You're hurt." It wasn't a question. Even in the dim light, Everett could see the dark stain spreading across her shirt where her hand pressed against her ribs. The dog whimpered softly, sensing his companion's distress. "It's not as bad as it looks," she said, but her pale complexion and the way she held herself suggested otherwise. "What's your name?" She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse to answer. Then she seemed to make a decision, meeting his eyes with a directness that spoke of desperation rather than deception. "Lila Morgan. This is Scout." She reached out to stroke the dog's head, and he leaned into her touch despite his own obvious discomfort. "We've been traveling for 3 days, maybe 4. Like I said, time gets fuzzy." "Running from what?" Another hesitation, longer this time. Lila's eyes darted toward the windows, as if expecting to see pursuers emerging from the gathering darkness. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said finally. "Heart attack. He was only 32, but he'd been under a lot of stress. Money troubles, bad investments. When I went through his papers after the funeral, I found out he owed money to some very unforgiving people." Everett had heard similar stories before, though usually from a distance. Gambling debts, loan sharks, the kind of dangerous financial entanglements that could destroy lives with ruthless efficiency. How much? $50,000, plus interest, plus penalties for late payment. She laughed bitterly. "Might as well be 50 million for all the chance I had of paying it. I sold everything, the house, his truck, my car, my grandmother's jewelry, everything, but it wasn't enough. It's never enough with these people. So you ran. What choice did I have? They made it clear that if I couldn't pay in cash, they'd accept other forms of compensation." The way she said it left no doubt about kind of compensation they had in mind. "I've been staying with friends, moving every few days, but they found me in Billings 2 weeks ago. If my neighbor hadn't warned me, Scout and I would have been caught in our sleep." The dog's ears perked up at his name, and he looked between Lila and Everett as if trying to assess whether this new human represented safety or threat. "How did you find this place?" "I didn't, not really. I was just driving, trying to put distance between us and them. Scout needed medical attention. He hurt his paw jumping out of a motel window when we had to leave fast, and I was getting dizzy from blood loss. I saw your road and thought maybe I could rest for a few hours before moving on." She gestured toward the blood-stained bandana tied around her left side. The makeshift bandage was clearly inadequate for whatever injury it was meant to cover. "But you stayed overnight." "I meant to leave before dawn, but I guess I was more hurt than I thought. When I woke up, it was already light, and I heard your truck coming up the drive. I was going to hide, but Scout couldn't move fast enough. And honestly, I'm not sure I could have either." Everett looked at the pair again, a wounded woman and her injured dog, exhausted from days of running from men who meant them harm. Everything about the situation screamed complications he didn't need and problems he didn't want. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to help them into his truck and drive them to the sheriff's office in town. Let the authorities sort it out. But something in Lila's eyes reminded him of the way Sarah used to look when she found injured. Animals on the ranch determined to help despite the cost or inconvenience. And Scout's protective posture brought back memories of their old collie, Rex, who had appointed himself guardian of the twin boys and shadowed their every step until the day he died of old age. "You light that lantern to make sure I'd find you?" Lila nodded. "I figured if I was going to be discovered, I'd rather meet you face to face than have you stumble over us in the dark. Seemed more honest that way." Honest. When was the last time? Someone had chosen honesty with him, especially when lies might have served them better. The townspeople were polite but distant. His business associates were professionally cordial, and most conversations he had these days were purely transactional. But this stranger, this trespasser who had every reason to deceive him, had chosen truth instead. "Can you stand?" "I think so." But when she tried to rise, her face went white and she swayed dangerously. Scout whined and tried to stand as well, managing only to put weight on 3 legs. "Don't." Everett moved closer, ignoring the dog's warning rumble. "You're both hurt worse than you're letting on." He knelt beside them, his hands automatically moving to check injuries with the competence of a man who had spent decades dealing with wounded livestock. The skills weren't so different when applied to humans. Assess the damage, stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient. "I have medical supplies in the barn," he said, making a decision that surprised him even as he spoke. "Nothing fancy, but enough to clean those wounds properly and see what we're dealing with. You don't have to." "No," he agreed. "I don't have to, but I'm going to anyway." For the first time since he'd found them, Leila smiled. It was a small thing, barely a lifting of the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her face entirely. "Thank you," she whispered. Everett stood and looked down at them, the wounded woman, the injured dog, the flickering lantern that had announced their presence in his carefully ordered world. Everything rational told him he was making a mistake that would complicate his life in ways he couldn't foresee. But as he headed toward the barn to gather medical supplies, he realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. Satisfaction of being needed by someone other than his cattle. The storm lantern continued to burn on the mantel, its steady flame pushing back the darkness that had settled over the Sloan ranch, like a promise that light could return to even the most shadowed places. The medical kit in the barn had been gathering dust for 3 years, untouched since the last time one of his bulls had torn itself on barbed wire. Everett lifted it from its hook on the wall, remembering the day he'd stocked it with supplies that had once been intended for his family's emergencies. Sarah had insisted on keeping a comprehensive first aid kit after the boys started climbing trees and riding horses, and her practical foresight had served the ranch well over the years. Now, as he carried the heavy metal box back toward the house, Everett felt the weight of irony. The supplies that hadn't been enough to save his own family might yet help these strangers who had stumbled into his isolated world. Back in the great room, he found Leila exactly where he'd left her, though she'd managed to coax Scout into a more comfortable position with his injured paw extended. The dog watched Everett's approach with continued wariness, but the growling had stopped. "Let's take a look at that side of yours first," Everett said, opening the kit and laying out supplies with the methodical precision of a man accustomed working with his hands. Antiseptic, gauze, tape, scissors, everything clean and organized, ready for emergencies that had never come to his own family. Leila hesitated, then slowly lifted her flannel shirt to reveal the makeshift bandage underneath. The blood-stained bandana was stuck to her skin, and Everett could see she'd been bleeding steadily despite her attempts to staunch the flow. "This is going to hurt," he warned, dampening a cloth with antiseptic. "Everything hurts right now," she replied with a weak attempt at humor. "A little more won't make much difference." But she was wrong. When Everett carefully peeled away the bandana, revealing a jagged gash that ran along her ribs, Leila bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. The wound was several inches long and deep enough to require stitches, clearly made by something sharp and unforgiving. "What did this?" "Barbed wire fence. I was running through a pasture in the dark 3 nights ago, trying to get away from headlights on the road behind me. Didn't see the fence until I was already through it." She managed a shaky breath. "Scout cleared it just fine, but I'm not as agile as I used to be." Everett cleaned the wound with careful thoroughness, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. He'd done this countless times with injured animals, but working on a human being brought back memories he'd tried to bury Sarah, teaching him basic first aid. The boy's scraped knees and elbows that had required his ministrations when their mother wasn't available. "You're good at this," Leila observed, watching his face as he worked. "Had practice. Running a ranch means dealing with injuries, usually to livestock, but the principles are the same. You have a family?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, and for a moment Everett's hand stilled. It was the first time in years anyone had asked him directly about his personal life, and he found himself unprepared for the way the simple inquiry cut through his carefully maintained defenses. "I did," he said finally, applying butterfly bandages to hold the wound closed. "My wife and 2 boys died in a barn fire 10 years ago. I'm sorry." The words were simple, but something in Lila's voice suggested she understood loss in ways that platitudes couldn't touch. "That's why you live alone out here. That's why." He secured the last bandage and sat back on his heels. "Now let's look at your friend there." Scout had been watching the entire procedure with the intense focus of a dog who understood that his human was being helped rather than harmed. When Everett turned his attention to the injured paw, the collie mix allowed himself to be examined with only a few warning whimpers. The paw was swollen and clearly painful, but Everett's careful probing revealed no broken bones. A sprain, most likely, suffered during the same escape that had left Lila bleeding. "He'll need to stay off it for a few days," Everett said, wrapping the paw in gauze and securing it with tape. "But he should heal up fine with rest." Scout sniffed at the bandage and looked up at Everett with what might have been gratitude. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of trust he'd shown. "There's a guest room upstairs," Everett heard himself saying. "You can both rest there tonight. Figure out your next move in the morning." Lila stared at him in surprise. "You don't even know us. For all you know, I could be lying about everything. The debt, the men chasing us, all of it." "Could be," Everett agreed. "But you're not. How can you be sure?" He considered the question as he packed away the medical supplies. How could he explain that after 10 years of isolation, he'd developed an instinct for reading people and the few interactions he couldn't avoid? That her story had the messy, complicated ring of truth rather than the smooth edges of a practiced lie? "Your dog," he said finally. "Animals don't bond with people who are fundamentally dishonest. Scout there trusts you completely, which tells me you're worth trusting." It was as close to sentiment as Everett had allowed himself in years, and he felt exposed by his own words. But Lila's smile was worth the vulnerability. "Scout's a good judge of character," she agreed, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He didn't like my husband much, come to think of it. Maybe I should have paid more attention to that." "Your husband the gambling?" "Started small. Poker games with friends, then casino trips, then online betting. By the end, he was placing bets on anything sports, politics, the weather. He kept promising he'd stop, kept saying he just needed one big win to get us back to even." She shook her head. "I should have left him, but you don't give up on family, you know. You keep hoping they'll find their way back to who they used to be." Everett understood that sentiment better than she could know. He'd spent the first few years after the fire hoping he'd wake up one morning and feel like himself again, that the grief would recede enough to let him remember joy without pain. "What kind of men are chasing you?" he asked. "Professional collectors, I think. They call themselves debt recovery specialists, but they're thugs in expensive suits. The kind who make problems disappear one way or another." Lila's hand moved unconsciously to her bandaged side. "They caught up with me in Billings, made it clear that running was only making things worse. Said they'd been patient because they respected my husband's memory, but patience has limits. $50,000, plus interest, plus penalties. It grows every day I don't pay." She laughed bitterly. "I've been running for 2 weeks and probably owe them $60,000 by now." Everett did quick mental calculations. $60,000 was a substantial sum to most people, but to him it represented less than a month's income from his cattle operation. The kind of money he spent without thinking on equipment upgrades or breeding stock. But he didn't share that information. Instead, he helped Lila to her feet, supporting her weight as they made their way to the stairs. Scout followed, limping but determined not to be separated from his human. The guest room hadn't been used since before the fire, and dust motes danced in the beam of Everett's flashlight as he checked to make sure everything was in order. Clean. Sheets on the bed, towels in the adjoining bathroom, a water pitcher on the nightstand. All the amenities Sarah had insisted on for the occasional visitor. "There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry during the night," he said, suddenly awkward in the face of his own hospitality. "Help yourself to whatever you need. Mr. Sloan." Everett. Everett. "I can't thank you enough for this. When I saw your truck coming up the drive, I thought my running was over. Instead, you've given us a chance to rest and heal. I won't forget that kindness." Standing in the doorway with the hall light behind him, Everett felt something shift inside his chest. For 10 years, his interactions with other people had been purely functional business transactions, brief exchanges with service providers, the minimal social contact required to maintain his hermit's existence. But here was someone thanking him not for his money or his business, but for simple human decency. When was the last time anyone had looked at him the way Lila was looking at him now, with genuine gratitude and the kind of warmth he'd almost forgotten existed? "Get some rest," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar emotion her thanks had stirred. "We'll talk more in the morning." But as he made his way downstairs and settled into his chair by the cold fireplace, Everett found that rest was the last thing on his mind. For the first time in years, his house held the sounds of other lives' footsteps overhead. Water running in the guest bathroom, the soft murmur of Lila's voice as she spoke to Scout. The storm lantern still flickered on the mantel, and Everett studied its steady flame as he considered what he'd gotten himself into. 2 strangers, both injured, both running from dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to extend their pursuit to anyone who helped their quarry. The smart thing would be to drive them to town in the morning, help them contact the authorities, let the system handle whatever legal remedies might exist for their situation. But as he listened to the quiet sounds of occupancy from upstairs sounds his house hadn't heard in a decade, Everett realized he wasn't ready to return to the silence just yet. Morning came earlier than usual to the Sloan ranch, announced not by Everett's customary alarm clock, but by the unfamiliar sound of movement in the kitchen below his bedroom. For a moment, caught between sleep and waking, he thought he was dreaming of the old days when Sarah would rise before dawn to start breakfast and pack lunches for the boys. Then memory crashed back, bringing with it the knowledge that strangers were moving through his house, and his hand reached instinctively for the loaded pistol he kept in his nightstand drawer. But as consciousness fully returned, so did the events of the previous evening. Lila and Scout, wounded and running, taking shelter in the first safe place they'd found in days. He lay still for a moment, listening to the careful sounds of someone trying not to make noise, cabinet doors closing softly, water running briefly, the quiet click of the stove being lit. When he finally made his way downstairs, Everett found Lila standing at his kitchen counter, fully dressed despite the early hour. She'd clearly made an attempt to clean up, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her clothes shaken free of yesterday's dust and debris. But the careful way she held herself, and the pale cast of her skin, betrayed the effort. This simple activity had cost her. Scout lay near her feet, his bandaged paw stretched out in front of him, but his tail thumped against the floor when Everett appeared. The dog's transformation from wary protector to cautious acceptance marked progress that hadn't gone unnoticed. "I hope you don't mind," Lila said, gesturing toward the coffee pot that was already brewing. "I wanted to make myself useful, and coffee seemed like a safe place to start." "When's the last time you ate?" She had to think about it, which told him everything he needed to know. "Yesterday morning, maybe. There was a diner in Havre where I stopped for gas." Everett opened his refrigerator and began pulling out eggs, bacon, and bread. Cooking had become a perfunctory activity for him over the past decade, fuel for his body rather than pleasure, but the presence of someone else in his kitchen awakened Muscle memories of breakfasts shared and appreciated. You don't have to cook for me, Lila protested. You're hurt and hungry. I have food. It's not complicated. But as he laid strips of bacon in the cast iron skillet that had been Sarah's favorite, Everett realized it was more complicated than he wanted to admit. The simple act of cooking for another person carried weight he hadn't anticipated, stirring emotions he'd thought safely buried. Tell me about the men chasing you, he said, partly to distract himself from unwelcome memories, and partly because he needed to understand the scope of the problem he'd invited into his life. Leela settled carefully at the kitchen table, and Scout limped over to rest his head on her knee. They call themselves Riverside Recovery Solutions, but that's just a business name. The real operation is run by a man named Vincent Carrera. He operates out of Billings, but his reach extends across 3 states, professional debt collectors. The kind who work outside legal channels. Banks and credit card companies have to follow laws about collection practices. But private debt gambling debts, loans from individuals, that's different. Carrera specializes in collecting what the legal system can't touch. Everett cracked eggs into the skillet, considering this information. He'd encountered men like Carrera in his business dealings over the years, though never directly. The kind of predators who circled the edges of legitimate enterprise, offering services that skirted the boundaries of the law. How did your husband get involved with them? It started with a poker game. Tommy was good at cards when he was sober, and he had a run of luck that lasted just long enough to make him overconfident. When his luck turned, he started borrowing to stay in the game. Small amounts at first, then larger ones as he tried to chase his losses. The familiar pattern of addiction and escalation. Everett had seen it destroy ranchers who gambled on commodity futures, businessmen who risked everything on speculative investments. The belief that the next bet, the next deal, would somehow erase all previous losses. Carrera was patient as long as Tommy was making payments. But after he died, they wanted the full amount immediately. Said the debt didn't die with the debtor. Lila's hand moved to the wedding ring hanging loose on her finger, and Everett noticed she wore it on a chain around her neck as well. A man's ring, presumably her husband's. You could have declared bankruptcy. I tried, but lawyers cost money. I didn't have, and Carrera made it clear that legal protections wouldn't matter to him. He said bankruptcy was just a piece of paper, and paper doesn't stop bullets. Everett served the eggs and bacon, noting the way Lila's eyes widened at the generous portions. When had she last had a full meal? When had anyone made sure she was properly fed and cared for? You said they found you in Billings, at my sister's house. I'd been staying there for a week, helping with her kids while she worked. I thought maybe if I kept moving, stayed with different friends and family members, I could buy enough time to figure out a permanent solution. She took a bite of bacon and closed her eyes briefly in appreciation. But they have resources I hadn't counted on. Private investigators, contacts in law enforcement, the kind of network that makes hiding almost impossible. What happened when they found you? Lila was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested the memory was still fresh and painful. 2 men, well-dressed, polite, professional. They knocked on my sister's door like they were selling insurance. But when I saw them through the window, I knew exactly who they were. There's something about their eyes cold, calculating. They see people as problems to be solved, rather than human beings with families and feelings. Scout whimpered softly, as if sensing his human's distress, and she reached down to stroke his head. I got out through the back window while they were talking to my sister at the front door. Scout and I made it to my car, but they saw us leaving. The chase lasted 12 hours, across 2 counties. Every time I thought I'd lost them, they'd appear in my rearview mirror again. How did you get away? Scout, actually. We stopped at a rest area where I thought we'd be safe, lots of people around, security cameras, the kind of place where violence would be too public. But they cornered me in the parking lot anyway. One of them grabbed my arm, and Scout went after him. Bit him hard enough to require stitches, I think. In the confusion, we got away, but not before one of them caught me with a knife as I was running. The wound Everett had cleaned and bandaged the night before. He looked at Scout with new respect, understanding now the fierce loyalty that had driven the dog to attack. Men who threatened his human, despite being outweighed and outnumbered. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of driving back roads, sleeping in the car, trying to stay ahead of them while Scout's paw got worse and I got weaker from blood loss. I was starting to think we weren't going to make it when I saw your road. Everett absorbed this information as he ate, his mind automatically calculating distances and timelines. If Lila's story was accurate, and everything about her demeanor suggested it was, then she and Scout had been running for their lives for a better part of a week, surviving on adrenaline and desperation. What's your plan, No? The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the immediate need for shelter and medical attention. I don't know, she admitted. Keep running, I suppose. Try to get far enough. A way that they'll decide I'm not worth the effort. Maybe find somewhere I can disappear, completely change my name, start over, become someone Vincent Carrera has no reason to look for. That's not a plan. That's just extended running. Do you have a better suggestion? Everett considered his words carefully. What he was thinking bordered on the kind of involvement he'd spent 10 years avoiding other people's problems, complications that could shatter the careful order of his isolated existence. But as he looked at Lila across his kitchen table, noting the way morning light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair and the quiet dignity with which she bore her circumstances, he realized his decade of emotional hibernation might be coming to an end. How much do you owe them? Total amount, with all the interest and penalties they've added? I don't know exactly. When I talked to them in Billings, they said $75,000. But like I said, grows every day. $75,000. Less than Everett had paid for the bulls he'd bought at yesterday's auction. A sum that represented catastrophic debt to Lila, but barely registered as significant in his personal accounting. I need to make some phone calls, he said, standing and carrying his empty plate to the sink. There are people who owe me favors, information networks that might be useful in understanding exactly who we're dealing with. The word had slipped out without conscious intention, but now that it hung in the air between them, Everett realized he meant it. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he decided that Lila and Scout's problems were now his problems as well. You came to my ranch for help, he said simply, so I'm going to help you. Everett, you don't understand what you're saying. These aren't people you negotiate with. They're predators who respect only strength and fear nothing but superior violence. Getting involved with me puts you in danger, maybe, but running indefinitely puts you in more danger. And I have resources you don't. Money, connections, property that's defensible if it comes to that. He turned to face her fully. Besides, this ranch has been too quiet for too long. Maybe it's time for some complications. For the first time since he'd found her on his hearth, Lila's composure cracked slightly. Tears gathered in her green eyes, though she blinked them back with the stubborn pride of someone who'd learned to rely on her own strength. Why, she whispered, why would you risk everything for strangers? Everett looked out the kitchen window at the mountains that had witnessed his family's joy and his solitary grief, searching for words to explain something he wasn't sure he understood himself. Maybe because it's been 10 years since anyone needed. My help was something that mattered, he said finally. And maybe because I'm tired of being the kind of man who turns away when people are hurting. The admission surprised him with its honesty. But as he spoke the words, Everett realized they contained a truth he'd been avoiding for years. His isolation hadn't just been about protecting himself from further loss. It had been about avoiding the responsibility that came with caring about other people's welfare. but looking at Lila and Scout, both wounded and both depending on his protection, he felt something awakening in his chest that had been dormant since the night his family died. Not just compassion, but purpose. The sense that his life might once again serve something larger than his own carefully maintained solitude. "Rest today," he told her. "Let your injuries heal while I make some inquiries. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out a permanent solution to your Vincent Carrera problem." As he headed for his office to begin making the phone calls that would draw him back into the world of human connection and conflict, Everett heard Lila call after him. "Thank you," she said simply. He paused at the doorway, struck once again by the power of genuine gratitude. "Thank me when it's over and you're safe." But privately, as he closed the office door behind him and reached for the phone, Everett Sloan realized he was already being thanked in ways Lila couldn't possibly know. For the first time in a decade, he had a reason to wake up that extended beyond the basic maintenance of his own existence, and that, he was beginning to understand, might be worth any risk. 3 days of phone calls had yielded more information than Everett had expected, and painted a grimmer picture than he'd hoped. Vincent Carrera was indeed a professional debt collector, but his operation extended far beyond simple money recovery. The man ran what amounted to a criminal enterprise, using legitimate business licenses as cover for activities that included money laundering, illegal gambling, and what his contacts delicately termed enforcement services. "He's got protection," his old friend Marcus Webb had told him during their conversation. Marcus worked for the FBI now, though their friendship dated back to their Army days 30 years ago. Local cops on his payroll, judges who owe him favors, even some federal agents who've been compromised. Taking him on through legal channels is like trying to nail jelly to a wall. But Marcus had also provided crucial intelligence. Carrera's operation, while extensive, was built on the foundation of appearing legitimate. Public attention was the one thing he couldn't afford, which meant he preferred to operate quietly, making problems disappear rather than creating spectacles that might draw unwanted scrutiny. "The girl's debt is real," Marcus had confirmed, "but it's been artificially inflated beyond any reasonable collection practice. What started as a legitimate $50,000 has become a weapon to keep her running and vulnerable. At this point, I don't think Carrera wants payment as much as he wants to make an example." This information had crystallized Everett's understanding of the situation. Lila wasn't just a debtor, she was a demonstration of what happened to people who tried to escape Vincent Carrera's web. Her continued flight served his business interests by showing other clients that running was futile, which meant that simply paying off her debt might not be enough to ensure her safety. Now, as Everett walked through the apple orchard behind his house, he considered the implications of what he'd learned. The orchard had been Sarah's pride and joy, 20 acres of carefully tended apple trees that had produced fruit for the local farmers, market, and enough cider to supply half the county. But like everything else connected to his family's memory, Everett had let it fall into neglect after the fire. The trees stood in uneven rows, their branches unpruned and wild, their trunks scarred by 10 winters of indifferent care. Weeds grew thick between the rows, and many of the older trees showed signs of disease and pest damage that proper maintenance would have prevented. It was a testament to the hardiness of the variety that any of them still lived, much less produced. The sparse, undersized fruit that dropped unnoticed each fall. "It breaks my heart to see them like this." Everett turned to find Lila approaching through the tall grass, moving carefully, but with more strength than she'd shown since arriving. Scout limped beside her, his bandaged paw still tender but healing. Well, 3 days of rest and regular meals had restored color to both their faces, though Lila still favored her injured side when she walked. "Sarah planted most of these herself," Everett said, running his hand along the bark of a nearby tree. "Spent years researching varieties that would thrive in this climate, grafting different types onto hardy rootstock. She used to say an apple tree was like a promise to the future, something that would feed people long after the person who planted it was gone. Leela moved closer, studying the neglected branches with the eye of someone who understood growing things. They're not dead, just dormant. Look here. She pointed to small buds forming along a branch. The sap's still running. The root systems are strong. With proper pruning and care, most of these could be producing again within 2 seasons. You know about orchards? My grandmother had a farm outside Great Falls. I spent summers there as a kid, helping her with the garden and the fruit trees. She taught me that plants want to thrive. You just have to remove what's preventing them from reaching their potential. Everett studied her profile as she examined the trees, noting the way her face softened when she talked about growing things. There was knowledge in her touch as she tested branches for flexibility and health, experience that spoke of more than childhood summers. After Tommy died, I thought about buying a small farm somewhere, she continued. Starting over with something simple and honest, growing food, maybe keeping a few animals. The kind of life where you measure success by what you've nurtured rather than what you've accumulated. What stopped you? The debt collectors found me before I could make it happen. Hard to plan for the future when you're not sure you'll survive the present. They walked deeper into the orchard, weaving between trees that stood like neglected sentinels. Scout ranged ahead of them, his mobility improving daily, clearly enjoying the freedom to explore after days of confinement in the house. I've been thinking about what you said, Everett began carefully. About Carrera not wanting payment as much as wanting to make an example. If that's true, then simply writing him a check won't solve your problem. Leela stopped walking and turned to face him. What did you find out? Vincent Carrera runs more than a debt collection business. He's built a criminal empire that depends on fear and the appearance of invincibility. People who cross him don't just pay money, they disappear, or worse. Your husband's debt has become secondary to the message your capture would send. The color drained from Lila's face as she absorbed this information. So I can never stop running. Not necessarily. But it means we need a different kind of solution than I originally thought. We? She gave him a searching look. Everett, I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I won't let you destroy your life trying to fix mine. You have a ranch to run, a business to manage. You can't just abandon everything to help a stranger. Maybe I'm not abandoning anything. Maybe I'm finally returning to something I abandoned 10 years ago. The admission surprised him with its honesty. As they stood among the neglected apple trees, Everett realized that caring about Lila and Scout's welfare had awakened something in him that had been dormant since the fire, the sense that his life could serve a purpose beyond mere survival. What do you mean? Before the fire, this ranch was more than just a business. It was a home, a place where people gathered, where we took care of our neighbors, and they took care of us. Sarah used to say that wealth without community was just elaborate loneliness. He gestured toward the abandoned orchard, the empty spaces where children's laughter had once echoed during harvest time. I turned this place into a fortress after I lost them. Kept everyone out, convinced myself that isolation was safety. But all I really did was create a different kind of death slower than fire, but just as final. Layla reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. Grief makes us do things that feel like protection, but are really just different forms of harm. You understand that? I ran away after Tommy died, too. Not from debt collectors, but from the life we'd built together. Sold everything, broke contact with friends, convinced myself that starting over meant leaving everything behind. She looked around the orchard with new understanding. Maybe we're both ready to stop running. Scout had found something interesting near the base of an old tree and was investigating it with the focused attention that only dogs could bring to mysterious scents. Watching him, Everett was struck by the way animals lived entirely in the present moment, finding joy and purpose wherever they happen to be. "There's a tool shed behind the barn," he said suddenly. "Pruning shears, grafting knives, everything. We'd need to start bringing this orchard back to life. It would take years to restore it properly. I have years. Question is whether you want to be here to see it happen." The invitation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond horticulture. Lila studied his face, searching for something she could trust. "What about Carrera?" "I'm still working on that. But in the meantime, these trees need attention they haven't had in a decade. And I could use help from someone who knows what they're doing." For the first time since he'd found her on his hearth, Lila smiled with something approaching genuine happiness. I'd like that very much." They spent the rest of the morning walking through the orchard, with Lila pointing out which trees could be saved and which had deteriorated beyond recovery. Her knowledge was extensive and practical, gained through years of working with her grandmother, and supplemented by her own study and experience. "The key is understanding that every tree is different," she explained, as she examined a particularly promising specimen. "You can't just apply universal techniques and expect success. You have to look at each one individually, understand its specific needs and challenges, then work with its natural tendencies rather than against them." Everett found himself thinking that her approach to trees might apply equally well to people: the patient observation, the willingness to work with existing strengths rather than imposing external solutions, the understanding that healing took time and couldn't be rushed out by afternoon. They were both dirty and tired, but energized in a way that surprised them. The simple act of planning renewal, of imagining the orchard restored to productivity and beauty, had lifted their spirits in ways that rest and medical attention couldn't match. "We should start with the trees closest to the house," Leela suggested, as they made their way back through the tall grass. "Get them healthy and productive first, then expand outward as we gain experience and confidence." Sounds like a sensible approach. But as they reached the edge of the orchard, Scout suddenly stiffened and let out a low growl. His hackles rose, and his attention focused on the long driveway that led from the main road, though no vehicle was visible through the trees. "What is it, boy?" Lila asked, but her voice carried the tension of someone who had learned to trust her dog's instincts about danger. Everett listened carefully, using skills honed by decades of ranch life to separate normal sounds from those that suggested trouble. There, the distant rumble of engines, multiple vehicles approaching at speed. "Get to the house," he said quietly. "Back door, through the kitchen. Take Scout upstairs and stay away from the windows. Everett, go. Now." But even as Lila hurried toward the house with Scout limping beside her, Everett knew their peaceful interlude was over. Vincent Carrera's patience had apparently reached its limit, and the sanctuary of the Sloan Ranch was about to be tested by forces that respected neither property lines nor the rights of those who simply wanted to be left alone. As he followed Lila toward the house at a deliberately calm pace, Everett's mind was already shifting from thoughts of apple trees and future harvests to more immediate concerns about protection and survival. The grafting knife he still carried in his pocket was designed for joining new life to old roots, but it might soon need to serve a very different purpose. The rumble of engines grew louder, and Everett realized that his decade of isolation was about to end in ways he had never imagined when he'd first decided to help a wounded stranger and her injured dog. The vehicles that emerged from the tree line were exactly what Everett had expected: 2 black SUVs with tinted windows, the kind of anonymous transportation that suggested both money and menace. They moved up his driveway with the confident precision of men who were accustomed to intimidating their targets through show of force alone. From his position at the kitchen window, Everett watched them park in a formation that blocked any escape route while maintaining clear lines of sight to all approaches. Professional tactics, executed with the kind of efficiency that came from extensive practice. 4 men emerged from the vehicles, their movements coordinated despite the casual way they surveyed his property. All wore dark suits that couldn't quite conceal the bulk of shoulder holsters, and their eyes moved with the constant assessment of predators, evaluating new territory. The man who appeared to be their leader was younger than Everett had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of expensive grooming that spoke of success in unsavory enterprises. He straightened his tie as he approached the front porch, his expression carrying the mild annoyance of someone dealing with a minor inconvenience that would soon be resolved. Everett met them at the front door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch with the unhurried confidence of a man on his own property. Behind him, he could hear Lila's footsteps moving across the floor above, hopefully following his instructions to stay away from the windows. "Mr. Sloan." The leader's voice carried a slight accent that suggested origins south of the border, though. His English was precise and cultured. "My name is Vincent Carrera. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I believe you're mistaken." Carrera smiled, the expression devoid of warmth or humor. "I don't think so. Mrs. Lila Morgan and her dog have been staying in your home for several days now. We've come to collect her. Don't know anyone by that name?" "Of course you don't." Carrera's tone suggested he was playing along with a game whose rules bored him. "Just as you don't know why someone has been purchasing groceries for 3 people instead of 1, or why your local veterinarian received a call about treating an injured border collie." The casual revelation of how thoroughly they'd investigated his recent activities was meant to demonstrate the futility of denial. These men had resources and connections that extended into every corner of the community, making privacy an illusion, and secrets impossible to maintain. "Even if I knew who you were talking about, what makes you think I'd hand anyone over to armed strangers who show up uninvited on my property?" "Because refusing would be extremely unwise." Carrera's pleasant facade slipped slightly, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mrs. Morgan owes my organization a substantial sum of money. Her debt, compounded by interest and penalties for non-payment, now exceeds $80,000. But more importantly, she has made the mistake of running from her obligations, which sets a very poor precedent for my other clients. Sounds like a civil matter. Maybe you should try the courts. The courts are slow, expensive, and bound by inconvenient rules about evidence and due process. I prefer more efficient methods of debt recovery." One of Carrera's men had begun walking a slow circuit around the house, ostensibly admiring the architecture, but actually conducting surveillance. Another remained by the vehicles, his hand resting casually on the butt of a pistol that was clearly visible beneath his jacket. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to resolve this matter like civilized men," Carrera continued. "Produce Mrs. Morgan and her dog, and we'll leave your property immediately. Refuse, and I'll be forced to take steps that will be unpleasant for everyone involved." Everett let his gaze drift across the 3 visible men, noting their positions and calculating distances with the automatic assessment of someone who had spent his army years in situations where such evaluations could mean the difference between life and death. "Here's what I think," he said finally. "I think you've made a serious mistake coming onto my ranch and making threats. I think you've mistaken me for someone who can be intimidated by suits and guns and talk about unpleasant consequences. Mr. Sloan, I think you should get back in your vehicles and drive away before you find out exactly how unpleasant things can get for people who threaten me on my own property." For the first time since their arrival, Carrera's composure showed cracks. Men like him were accustomed to compliance, to the fear that their reputation and resources normally generated. Defiance was an unexpected variable that disrupted their standard operating procedures. "You're making a very serious mistake," Carrera said, his voice hardening. "I have more men than you can imagine, resources you can't match, and connections that extend into law enforcement agencies at every level. Fighting me is like fighting the tide, inevitable and ultimately futile. Maybe, but you're standing on my land, threatening someone under my protection, and I have a constitutional right to defend my property against trespassers. Question is whether you want to test how far I'm willing to take that right. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, each man measuring the other's resolve and calculating the costs of escalation. Carrera's operation depended on projecting invincibility, but backing down from a single rancher would damage that carefully cultivated image. From inside the house came a sound that made everyone freeze, the clear, sweet notes of a piano melody drifting through the open windows. Someone was playing the old pump organ in the front parlor, coaxing music from keys that hadn't been touched in a decade. The melody was one Everett recognized, though it took him a moment to place it. Amazing Grace, played with the simple, heartfelt phrasing that Sarah had favored. But this wasn't Sarah's touch. The style was different, more hesitant, as if the player was learning the instrument's quirks and capabilities. Lila, despite his instructions to stay hidden, she had found the dust-covered organ and was announcing her presence in the most peaceful way imaginable. The music continued, growing stronger and more confident as she found her rhythm, filling the tense silence with something beautiful and wholly unexpected. Carrera's face showed surprise and confusion. He had come prepared for denial, resistance, even violence, but not for hymns played on a pump organ by the woman he was hunting. "That's her, isn't it?" he asked, his composure slipping further. "Playing music while we discuss her fate. Either she's very brave or very foolish." "Maybe both," Everett said. "Or maybe she's just tired of running and decided to stop." The music shifted to another familiar hymn, "How Great Thou Art." Played with increasing confidence and skill, Everett found himself remembering Sunday mornings when Sarah would practice these same songs, preparing for church services where her music would lift the spirits of an entire congregation. But now the music served a different purpose, a declaration that beauty and peace could exist even in the presence of violence and threat. Lila was making a statement, though whether it was directed at Carrera or at Everett himself wasn't entirely clear. "Tell her to come outside," Carrera ordered. "This game has gone on long enough. Tell her yourself." But even as he spoke, Everett heard footsteps on the stairs inside the house, followed by the front door opening behind him. Lila emerged onto the porch, moving carefully but with obvious determination. Scout limped beside her, his loyalty overriding his fear as he positioned himself between his human and the stranger's. "Mr. Carrera," Lila said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I wondered when you'd find me. Mrs. Morgan, you've led us quite a chase. I've been recovering from the wounds your men gave me. Knife cuts take time to heal properly." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, and Everett saw Carrera's jaw tighten with annoyance. Violence was a tool these men used regularly, but they preferred not to have their methods discussed so openly. "You owe my organization money," Carrera said. "Substantial money, with interest and penalties that grow daily. Your husband's debt doesn't disappear simply because he's dead. My husband's debt was $50,000. You've inflated it to justify continued harassment and threats. Debts have consequences, Mrs. Morgan. Your husband understood that when he accepted our terms. My husband was a sick man who made terrible decisions. But I'm not responsible for every choice he made, and I won't spend the rest of my life paying for his mistakes." Everett listened to this exchange with growing understanding of Lila's character. She wasn't cowering or pleading. She was facing her tormentors with the quiet dignity of someone who had found strength in unexpected places. "Nevertheless," Carrera continued, "the debt exists and it will be paid. The only question is whether payment comes in money or other forms of compensation." The threat was clear, and Everett felt his patience finally reach its breaking point. For 10 years, he had withdrawn from conflict, avoiding confrontation in favor of isolation and self-protection. But standing on his porch, listening to these. Predators discussed a woman who had brought music back into his house. He felt something awakening that had been dormant since his army days. "I'll pay the debt," he said suddenly. Both Lila and Carrera turned to stare at him in surprise. "Everett, no," Lila protested. "I won't let you." $80,000, he continued, ignoring her objection. "Wire transfer, cash, however you want it. But then Mrs. Morgan's obligation to your organization ends permanently." Carrera studied him with newfound interest, recognizing the presence of serious money in a way that changed the entire dynamic of their interaction. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Sloan. But I'm afraid the matter isn't quite that simple. Mrs. Morgan's debt is only part of a larger issue. She has information about my organization's operations that could prove embarrassing if shared with the wrong people." "What information?" "Her husband kept records, Mr. Sloan. Names, dates, financial transactions. Very detailed records that documented not just his own gambling activities, but those of many other clients. Mrs. Morgan inherited those records along with his debts." Everett felt the situation shifting into more dangerous territory. If Lila possessed evidence of Carrera's illegal activities, then her value as a hostage far exceeded any monetary debt. "I don't have any records," Lila said firmly. "Tommy's gambling destroyed everything we had. If there were records, they were destroyed along with everything else. Perhaps. But I can't take that chance, can I? Too much depends on maintaining the confidentiality of my client relationships." The standoff had evolved beyond simple debt collection into something more complex and more dangerous. Carrera needed to silence Lila permanently, not just collect money from her dot, but as Everett prepared to respond, he heard something that made him smile for the first time since the confrontation began. The distant sound of vehicles approaching. On his long driveway, multiple vehicles moving fast. "Expecting company?" Carrera asked, his confidence wavering slightly. "As a matter of fact, yes," Everett replied. "Some old friends who were very interested to learn about your organization's activities. Amazing how quickly people respond when you tell them armed strangers are threatening your guests." The approaching vehicles crested the hill, revealing themselves to be sheriff's department cruisers and what looked like federal law enforcement. More vehicles than Carrera had met, and all of them moving with the purposeful urgency of a coordinated operation. "Seems your luck is finally run out, Carrera," Everett said as the man's face went pale. "Turn around slowly and put your hands where everyone can see them. I'd hate for this to end in gunfire on such a beautiful day." As law enforcement vehicles surrounded the ranch house and federal agents began taking Carrera's men into custody, Everett realized that his decade of isolation was truly over. He had made enemies today, powerful ones who would not forget or forgive his interference in their operations. But standing beside Lila on his front porch, listening to Scout's tale thumping against the wooden boards as he sensed the change in mood, Everett found that he didn't care about the risks he'd taken on. For the first time in 10 years, he had chosen to fight for something that mattered. And that choice had awakened parts of himself he thought were buried forever with his family. The federal agents were thorough in their search of Carrera's vehicles, and what they found painted a picture far more complex than simple debt collection. FBI agent Sandra Martinez, who had coordinated the operation at Everett's request through his old friend Marcus Webb, spread the confiscated documents across Everett's kitchen table like pieces of an intricate puzzle. "Your friend Mr. Carrera runs quite an operation," Martinez said, adjusting her reading glasses as she sorted through files and electronic devices. "Debt collection is just the surface layer. Underneath, we're looking at money laundering, illegal gambling, real estate fraud, and what appears to be a systematic land acquisition scheme." Everett studied the papers, noting names and addresses. That meant nothing to him, but clearly held significance for the federal investigators. Lila sat beside him, her face growing paler as she recognized some of the documentation. "These are Tommy's records," she said, pointing to a folder marked with her late husband's name. "But they're not the ones he kept at home. These are much more detailed, more comprehensive. Your husband was working for them," Martinez explained gently. "Not just as a client, but as a record keeper. He documented transactions for dozens of Carrera's operations across 3 states. Names, amounts, dates, methods of payment, everything needed to build a criminal case." The revelation hit Lila like a physical blow. She had known about Tommy's gambling addiction, had even suspected that his debts were larger than he'd admitted. But discovering that he had been actively involved in criminal operations, rather than simply their victim, changed everything. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Tommy was weak, not evil. He would never knowingly participate in something like this. The evidence suggests he started as a client, just like you said," Martinez continued, her voice professionally compassionate. "But as his debts grew, Carrera offered him a way to work off what he owed. Record keeping, document management, basic bookkeeping for what Tommy probably thought were legitimate business operations." Scout, who had been lying quietly at Lila's feet, rose and pressed against her leg as if sensing her distress. She reached down to stroke his head, her hand trembling slightly. "When did he realize what he was really documenting?" Everett asked. "Based on the dates and the increasing detail in his records, I'd say about 6 months before his death. That's when his notes become more comprehensive, more specific about illegal activities, almost as if he was building a case." Martinez pulled out a sealed evidence bag containing what appeared to be a letter handwritten on familiar stationery. "We found this in his files. It's addressed to you, Mrs. Morgan, but never delivered." With shaking hands, Lila accepted the bag and read the letter through the clear plastic. As she progressed through her husband's words, tears began streaming down her face. "He was trying to get evidence to the FBI," she said finally. "He knew he was in too deep to escape on his own, but he thought if he could provide enough information to bring down Carrera's operation, they might offer him protection in exchange for his cooperation." "What happened?" Everett asked. "Heart attack," Martinez said simply. "According to the medical examiner's report, completely natural causes. No signs of foul play, no evidence of poisoning or violence. But the timing was certainly convenient for Mr. Carrera. Or maybe the stress of living with what he'd gotten involved in was enough to kill him," Lila said bitterly. "Tommy always had high blood pressure, and the guilt of discovering he'd been part of something that hurt innocent people would have eaten him alive." Everett studied the forged debt papers that Martinez had extracted from Carrera's files. The numbers told a different story than the one Carrera had been selling. The original debt was $12,000, he observed. Not $50,000 like Lila was told. Correct. Mr. Carrera inflated the amount to make Mrs. Morgan more vulnerable and to justify the resources he was spending to track her down. But the real prize was never the money. It was making sure the records her husband compiled never reached law enforcement. "Which means they've been chasing me not because I owe them money, but because they think I have evidence that could destroy their operation. Evidence that could send dozens of people to prison and seize millions of dollars in illegal assets," Martinez confirmed. "From Carrera's perspective, eliminating you was a matter of organizational survival." The implications of this revelation changed everything about Lila's situation. She hadn't been running from debt collectors, but from criminals who viewed her as an existential threat to their entire enterprise. "But I don't have any records," she protested. "After Tommy died, I went through everything in her house. There were some gambling receipts, credit card statements, the usual paperwork of someone with financial problems, but nothing like what you're describing." "Your husband was smarter than that," Martinez said with something approaching admiration. "He hid the real evidence where you'd be safe from it unless something happened to him. A safety deposit box, registered under an assumed name, but with you listed as the beneficiary. She handed Lila a key that had been found in Tommy's files, along with paperwork for a bank in Great Falls that neither Lila nor Everett recognized. He must have opened it during one of his trips to see the specialists about his heart condition, Lila said, staring at the key as if it might explode. All those medical appointments I couldn't attend because of work he was building an insurance policy. A policy that nearly got you killed, Everett observed grimly. And would have if you hadn't taken her in, Martinez added. Carrera's organization had plans for Mrs. Morgan that went well beyond debt collection. Her disappearance was meant to send a message to anyone else who might consider cooperating with law enforcement. Scout whimpered softly, as if responding to the tension in the room, and Lila gathered him into her lap despite his size. The dog's solid presence seemed to anchor her as she processed the magnitude of what her husband had left behind. What happens now? She asked. Now we retrieve the evidence from that safety deposit box and use it to dismantle Carrera's entire operation, Martinez said. Your husband documented everything: names, dates, financial transactions, property acquisitions, even recording of conversations where criminal activities were discussed openly. But that makes me a witness in a federal case. Yes, which means you'll be under government protection until Carrera and his associates are tried and convicted. Depending on how extensive the evidence is, that could take years. The prospect of continued running, even under official protection, clearly devastated Lila. She had just begun to imagine a life of stability and peace, working beside Everett to restore the apple orchard and build something meaningful from the ruins of their separate losses. There might be another option, Everett said slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if Carrera's people believed the evidence had been destroyed? I'm not sure I follow, Martinez said. Carrera thinks Lila has the records, but she doesn't. They're in a safety deposit box that he doesn't know about. What if we let him think he's succeeded in eliminating both Lila and the threat she represents? Lila stared at him in shock. You're talking about faking my death. I'm talking about giving you a chance at the life you deserve. New identity, clean background, a legitimate fresh start somewhere far from Vincent Carrera's reach. The FBI doesn't typically engage in elaborate deception schemes to help witnesses disappear, Martinez said dryly. We prefer straightforward prosecution and witness protection. But you need Carrera's organization to believe they've won, Everett pressed. If they think the threat is eliminated, they'll relax their security, become careless, make mistakes that will help you build your case. Isn't that worth considering? Martinez studied both of them with the calculating gaze of someone weighing risks against potential benefits. What exactly are you proposing? House fire, Everett said simply. Tragic accident that destroys the main building and kills everyone inside. Lila Morgan dies in the blaze, along with her dog and the man who tried to help them. Meanwhile, the real Lila starts over somewhere else with a new name and a legitimate background. And you? Lila asked quietly. What happens to you in this scenario? I disappear too. Everett Sloan dies in the fire, but someone else, someone with clean papers and no connection to Vincent Carrera, survives to start over. The kitchen fell, silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and Scout's gentle breathing. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Everett of the evening he'd first found Lila and Scout on his hearth. You'd give up everything, Lila said wonderingly. Your ranch, your business, your entire life. What life? For 10 years, I've been hiding here like a ghost haunting his own existence. Maybe it's time for both of us to stop running from the past and start building a future. Martinez shook her head slowly. Even if such a plan were feasible, and I'm not saying it is, it would require extensive federal resources and coordination with multiple agencies. The kind of operation that takes months to plan and execute properly. How long before Carrera's people realize he's been arrested and start looking for revenge? They already know. We had to leave some of his organization intact to avoid alerting the entire network. Word will be out within hours that their boss is in federal custody. The urgency of their situation was becoming clear. With Carrera arrested, but his organization still functional, the danger to Lila had actually increased rather than diminished. His lieutenants would be looking to tie up loose ends and eliminate potential witnesses. Then we don't have months, Everett said grimly. We have hours, maybe days before they come here in force. As if summoned by his words, Scout suddenly lifted his head and growled low in his throat. His attention was focused on the windows facing the front drive, his body tense with the alertness that had served them so well in detecting Carrera's arrival. But this time, instead of the rumble of multiple engines, they heard the distinctive whine of ATVs approaching through the forest vehicles that could navigate rough terrain and approach the ranch house without using the main driveway. They're already here, Lila whispered, her face going white. Martinez was already reaching for her radio, calling for backup that would take too long to arrive. The nearest law enforcement was 30 minutes away, and the federal agents who had arrested Carrera were already en route back to Billings with their prisoners. How many ATVs? Everett asked, moving to the window for a better view. Sounds like 4, maybe 5, Martinez replied, which means we're outnumbered and outgunned. But as Everett watched the shadows moving through the trees, he realized that Vincent Carrera's men had made the same mistake their boss had made. They had assumed they were dealing with an ordinary rancher who could be intimidated into submission. They were about to learn the difference between Vincent Carrera's version of violence and the kind that came from 30 years of defending something worth dying for. Agent Martinez, he said quietly, I need you to take Lila and Scout upstairs and barricade yourselves in the master bedroom. There's a radio in the knit-stand. Contact your backup and tell them to approach from the north pasture, not the main drive. What are you going to do? I'm going to remind these people that they're not the only ones who know how to fight. As the sound of ATVs grew closer and muzzle flashes began appearing among the trees, Everett Sloan realized that his decade of mourning was finally, definitively over. What remained was to discover whether the man he'd been before the fire still existed somewhere beneath 10 years of grief and isolation. The forged debt papers still lay scattered across his kitchen table, evidence of the lies that had driven Lila into his life and transformed them both. But as he reached for the rifle cabinet he'd installed after the fire, Everett realized that the papers represented something more than deception. They were proof that some lies could lead to unexpected truths. Tommy Morgan's debt had been fabricated, inflated beyond recognition to serve Carrera's purposes. But the love that had grown between Everett and Lila was real, as was the purpose he'd rediscovered in protecting something precious from those who would destroy it. The sound of breaking glass from the front windows announced that their attackers had arrived, and Everett knew that the time for reflection was over. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether the new life he and Lila had begun to imagine together would survive its first real test. The antique Winchester rifle felt familiar in Everett's hands despite the years since he'd last needed it for anything more serious than putting down injured livestock. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of Sloan men who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you loved was to be willing to fight for it. From upstairs came the sound of furniture being moved as Martinez followed his instructions, barricading herself, Lila, and Scout. In the master bedroom, the old house was solidly built, its log walls thick enough to stop small arms fire. But Everett knew their defensive advantages would only last as long as their attackers remained outside. The ATV engines had gone silent, which meant Carrera's men were now positioned around the house and preparing for their assault. Through the kitchen window, Everett caught glimpses of movement among the outbuildings, dark shapes that flitted between the barn and the equipment shed with the practiced. Stealth of men who made their living through violence. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb. Back up en route. ETA 20 minutes. Stay alive. 20 minutes. In a firefight, that was an eternity. But as Everett moved through his house, checking sight lines and defensive positions, he found himself thinking not about the tactical situation, but about the conversation he'd had with Lila in the apple orchard that morning. Her observation that plants wanted to thrive, that they just needed someone to remove what was preventing them from reaching their potential. For 10 years, grief had been the thing preventing him from thriving, choking off his connections to other people like weeds around the base of a tree. But helping Lila and Scout had begun the process of cutting away those restraints, allowing something new to grow in soil that had been left fallow too long. A crash from the front porch announced that the assault was beginning. Everett positioned himself behind the heavy oak dining table that Sarah had inherited from her grandmother, using its solid mass as cover while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the main entrance. The front door exploded inward under the impact of a battering ram, and the first attacker rushed through the opening with the confident aggression of someone who expected minimal resistance. He was young, probably not much older than Everett's sons would have been, and his expensive tactical gear suggested that Carrera paid his enforcers well. But the man's confidence evaporated when Everett's first shot caught him center mass, dropping him to the hardwood floor with a finality that sent a clear message to his companions about the level of resistance they could expect. Federal agent. Martinez's voice rang out from upstairs. You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender. Her announcement was met with a burst of automatic weapons fire that splintered the staircase, banister, and sent splinters of wood flying through the great room. These men hadn't come to negotiate or take prisoners. They were here to eliminate witnesses and tie up loose ends permanently. The second attacker tried to use his fallen companion's body as cover while advancing toward Everett's position, but the dining table provided excellent protection and a stable shooting platform. Everett's second shot was as accurate as his first, proving that some skills, once learned, were never completely forgotten. But even as he engaged the attackers at the front of the house, Everett could hear movement at the back door and windows. They were being assaulted from multiple directions simultaneously, and no matter how well he fought, he couldn't be everywhere at once. From upstairs came the distinctive bark of Scout's voice, followed by men's shouts and the crash of breaking glass. They were coming through the second-story windows, rappelling down from the roof or climbing up from the porch. Everett! Lila's voice carried a note of terror that cut through the sounds of gunfire like a blade. They're in the house. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. With attackers both downstairs and upstairs, the women and Scout were trapped between opposing forces with no clear avenue of escape. But as Everett considered his options, he remembered something his army instructor had taught him decades ago. When facing superior numbers, the key wasn't to fight them on their terms, but to change the nature of the engagement entirely. The propane tank for the house's heating system was located in the basement, connected to the main living areas by a serju network of pipes that ran through the walls. A single well-placed shot could turn his home into something far more dangerous than a defensive position. It would mean destroying everything he and Sarah had built together, obliterating the physical reminders of their life as surely as the fire had claimed their family. But those were just things, and things could be replaced. The lives upstairs could not. Martinez, he shouted up the stairwell. Can you get to the back bedroom? Negative. They've got the hallway covered. Then get ready to jump. Before she could ask what he meant, Everett was moving toward the basement stairs, his rifle ready for whatever resistance he might encounter. The basement had been his refuge in the years after the fire, a workshop where he could lose himself in projects that demanded nothing more than mechanical precision. Now it would serve a very different purpose. The basement was empty of attackers, though he could hear movement overhead as Carrera's men spread through the house in search of their targets. The propane tank sat in its metal housing like a sleeping giant, connected to a web of pipes that distributed heat throughout the building. One shot. That was all it would take to turn his sanctuary into an inferno. That would make the barn fire look like a campfire. But as Everett raised his rifle and sighted on the tank's valve assembly, he hesitated. This house contained the last physical evidence of his family's existence: photographs, furniture, Sarah's music, the boys' toys that he'd never been able to discard. Destroying it would be like killing them all over again. From upstairs came the sound of Scout barking frantically, followed by Lila's voice raised in defiance rather than fear. She was fighting back, refusing to surrender even when faced with impossible odds. The woman who had brought music back to his house deserved a man who would fight for her with the same courage she was showing. She deserved someone who understood that the past should serve the future, not imprison it. Everett pulled the trigger. The explosion was everything he had expected and more. A rolling thunder that shook the house to its foundations and sent flames racing through the walls with the hunger of something long denied. But the blast also accomplished exactly what he'd intended. It changed the tactical situation from a siege to an evacuation, forcing everyone in the building to focus on escape rather than combat. He took the basement stairs 3 at a time, emerging into a great room that was already filling with smoke. The attackers who had been advancing on his position were now falling back toward the exits, their mission abandoned in favor of simple survival. But the stairs to the second floor were blocked by debris and flame, cutting off his route to Lila and the others. The back bedroom, he shouted, hoping his voice would carry through the chaos. Jump into the hay pile behind the barn. There was no response, but through the growing smoke, he could see figures moving on the second-story porch. Martinez had found a way out, and she was helping Lila through one of the bedroom windows. Scout appeared at the window opening, his form silhouetted against the flames behind him. For a moment, the dog hesitated, clearly terrified by the height and the fire. But then he leaped with the faith that his humans would catch him or die trying. Everett sprinted toward the back of the house, reaching the hay pile just as Scout landed hard but safely in the loose straw. The dog was followed moments later by Lila, who rolled with the impact and came up gasping but uninjured. Martinez was the last to jump, and by the time she hit the hay pile, the entire second story was engulfed in flames that reached toward the night sky like accusing fingers. "Is everyone okay?" Everett asked, helping them to their feet and leading them away from the burning house. "Bruised but breathing," Martinez reported. "What about the attackers?" "The ones who survived are long gone. Nobody sticks around to fight a house fire." They reached the relative safety of the equipment shed and turned to watch Everett's home being consumed by flames. They were eerily reminiscent of the barn fire that had claimed his family. But this time, the fire was his choice, his weapon, his way of protecting what mattered most. "I'm sorry," Lila said quietly, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I know what this house meant to you." "It was the past," Everett replied, surprised by how much peace he felt watching it burn. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about the future." The sound of approaching helicopters announced that federal backup was finally arriving. Searchlights cutting through the smoke to illuminate the scene of destruction. But even as law enforcement moved to secure the area and hunt for the remaining attackers, Everett found himself thinking about apple trees and second chances. "Agent Martinez," he said as the helicopters landed in his front pasture, "about that plan I mentioned earlier, the one involving new identities and fresh starts. After tonight, I think we can make some calls," she replied with a grim smile. "Vincent Carrera's organization just tried to kill a federal agent. That tends to get people's attention at very high levels." Scout pressed against Lila's leg, seeking comfort from the trauma of fire and violence. and she gathered him into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had already lost too much. "Where would we go?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere with good soil for apple trees," Everett said. "Somewhere we can plant something new and watch it grow." As the flames consumed the last of his old life, Everett Sloan felt something he hadn't experienced since the night his family died. The certainty that tomorrow would be better than today, that the future held possibilities worth the price of leaving the past behind. The antique Winchester lay forgotten in the hay pile, its job finished. Like the house, it belonged to the man he used to be. The man he was becoming would need different tools for the work ahead, a grafting knife, perhaps, and the patience to nurture new life from old roots. Behind them, the house fire burned with an intensity that would leave nothing but ash and memories. But ahead of them, invisible in the darkness beyond the reaching flames, lay 20 acres of neglected apple trees, waiting for someone brave enough to believe in second chances and skilled enough to make them bloom. 3 months later, the barn bell that had once called Everett's family to safety rang out across a very different landscape, announcing not danger, but the end of another productive day. The sound carried across rolling hills where cattle grazed. Beneath a broader sky, in a valley 500 miles from the ashes of the Sloan Ranch, the man who rang the bell was officially named David Morrison, according to the federal documents that had given him a new life along with a new identity. But to the neighbors who had watched him restore abandoned dairy farm with patient determination, he was simply the quiet rancher who had bought the Peterson place and brought it back to life, the woman who emerged from the modest farmhouse at the sound of the bell was known as Ellen Morrison, though the grace with which she moved and the music that often drifted from their windows suggested depths that her simple name couldn't capture. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived terrible things and emerged stronger, her green eyes clear and untroubled by the shadows that had once haunted them. Between them ranged a dog, whose official registration listed him as Banner, but who answered just as readily to Scout when they thought no one was listening. His limp had healed completely, and he moved across the pastures with the joy of an animal who had found his true home. "How did the grafting go today?" Ellen asked as David approached the house, his hands still dirty from the afternoon's work. In the orchard they were establishing behind the main buildings. "Better than expected. The rootstock took to the new varieties like they were made for each other." He smiled at the memory of patient work rewarded with small signs of success. "Your grandmother's techniques worked just as well in Oregon as they did in Montana." They had chosen this place carefully, with input from federal agents who understood the delicate balance between hiding and living. The climate was similar enough to Montana to support the apple varieties they wanted to grow, but the culture was different enough to help them blend in among the independent-minded farmers who valued privacy and asked few questions about their neighbors' pasts. "Agent Martinez called while you were working," Ellen said as they walked toward the house together. "The trial ended yesterday. Guilty verdicts on all counts." David stopped walking, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Vincent Carrera and his organization had finally faced justice, which meant the threat that had driven them from their old lives was finished forever. 25 to life for Carrera himself, Ellen continued. His lieutenants got 10 to 15 years each. The judge said it was one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprises he'd ever seen dismantled. What about the evidence from Tommy's safety deposit box? Crucial to the prosecution. Martinez said without those records, half of Carrera's network would have walked free. She looked across their land with satisfaction. Tommy finally did something right, even if it took dying to accomplish it. They had retrieved the hidden evidence 3 days after the house fire, driving to Great Falls in a borrowed car, while federal agents maintained the fiction that David Morrison and Ellen Morrison had perished in the flames, along with Lila Morgan and Everett Sloan. The safety deposit box had contained everything Agent Martinez had promised, and more detailed records of criminal activities spanning 5 years and 3 states. But it had also contained something else, a letter from Tommy to Lila, written in the weeks before his death, explaining not just what he'd discovered about Carrera's operations, but why he'd documented everything so carefully. "I know I can never undo the damage my weakness caused," he had written. "But maybe I can leave you something valuable enough to buy your freedom. These records are my apology and my final gift to you. Use them to build the life we should have had together." It was, Ellen reflected, the most thoughtful thing her husband had ever done, even if she'd had to become someone else to benefit from it. "There's something else," she said as they reached the porch. "Martinez wants to visit next month. Official business, she says, but I think she's curious about how we're doing. She's welcome, but she have to call me David." They had lived with their new identities for long enough now that the names felt natural, though they still occasionally caught themselves starting to use their real ones in unguarded moments. The Federal Witness Protection Program had been thorough in creating their new backgrounds, birth certificates, social security numbers, employment histories that would withstand casual scrutiny, but the most important protection came from their own careful attention to detail. David Morrison was a quieter man than Everett Sloan had been, more cautious about drawing attention to himself. Ellen Morrison was more outgoing than Lila Morgan had ever been, confident in ways that came from knowing she would never again have to run from dangerous men in the middle of the night. "How are the new calves doing?" Ellen asked as they settled on the porch swing that David had built to match the one from their previous life. "Growing fast. The Peterson genetics are better than I expected, and the grazing here is some of the richest I've ever seen." He gestured toward the pastures, where black shapes moved slowly through grass that was still green despite the approaching autumn. "We'll have a good herd to sell next spring." They had started small, buying a modest ranch with money that officially came from David Morrison's inheritance from a fictional uncle. In reality, the funds represented a fraction of the assets that had been seized from Vincent Carrera's organization and quietly redirected to compensate his victims. But the work was familiar and satisfying, a continuation of skills that both had learned in their previous lives. David's knowledge of cattle breeding translated perfectly to his new circumstances, while Ellen's understanding of sustainable farming practices had helped them develop an operation that was both profitable and environmentally responsible. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by while you were in the South pasture," Ellen said. "She wanted to invite us to the Harvest Festival next weekend. Said it wouldn't be the same without our apple cider." Their nearest neighbor was a widow in her 70s who had made them feel welcome from the day they'd arrived. Like many of the older farmers in the valley, she had an intuitive understanding that some people came to the country seeking peace rather than profit, and she respected their privacy while offering friendship. "Did you tell her yes?" "I told her. We'd think about it, but I'd like to go, if you're comfortable with it." Community events still made David nervous, though he recognized that complete isolation would eventually draw more attention than careful participation. They had attended church services and county meetings, always together, always watchful, gradually building the network of casual relationships that marked them as legitimate residents rather than temporary visitors. "We'll go," he decided. "It's time." They sat in comfortable silence as evening settled over their valley, watching the last light fade behind hills that rolled away toward a horizon unmarked by the mountains that had dominated their previous lives. The landscape was gentler here, more forgiving, suited to people who had learned the value of quiet contentment. Scout appeared from wherever he'd been exploring, his tail wagging as he settled at their feet with the satisfaction of a dog who had spent the day doing important work. He had adapted to their new life with the resilience that came naturally to animals, though David sometimes caught him staring at the road that led to their farm, as if remembering other places and other dangers. Do you ever miss it? Ellen asked quietly. The old life, before everything went wrong? David considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked about the past. There were things he missed, the familiar contours of Montana's mountains, the history embedded in buildings his family had constructed with their own hands, the sense of continuity that came from living where multiple generations had worked, the same land. But there were other things he didn't miss at all. The isolation that had become a prison rather than a sanctuary. The weight of grief that had pressed down on every moment of every day. The gradual deadening of hope that had made him believe his best years were behind him rather than ahead. "I miss who we were before the trouble started," he said finally, "but I wouldn't trade who we've become for anything we lost. Even knowing what it cost? The ranch, the history, everything your family built? Buildings can be replaced. Land can be bought. History can be made anywhere. People decide to love each other and work toward something better." He reached for her hand, marveling as always at how perfectly her fingers fit between his. "What we have now, what we're building together, that's worth more than anything I left behind." The barn bell chimed softly in the evening breeze, a sound that had once announced tragedy but now marked the peaceful rhythm of days well lived. Tomorrow would bring more work in the orchard, more progress toward the future they were constructing one tree at a time. But tonight was for sitting on their porch, holding hands in the gathering darkness, and feeling grateful for the chain of circumstances that had brought them together. Violence and loss had driven them from their old lives, but choice and hope were shaping their new one dot in the distance. A truck turned off the main highway and began making its way up their long driveway, its headlights cutting through the dusk, with purpose rather than casualness. David tensed automatically, old instincts stirring at the sight of unexpected visitors after dark. Ellen squeezed his hand reassuringly as she recognized the vehicle's familiar outline. "It's just Sheriff Kowalski," she said, "probably checking on the Henderson place again. He's been worried about her since her grandson moved to Portland." The sheriff was a good man who took seriously his responsibility for the isolated farms scattered throughout his jurisdiction. He had stopped by several times during their first month, officially welcoming them to the community while subtly assessing whether they represented any sort of threat to his neighbors. But as the truck drew closer, Scout rose to his feet with a low growl that suggested he sensed something wrong about this particular visit. The dog's instincts had saved them before, and David had learned to trust the animal's judgment about potential dangers. "Maybe we should go inside," he suggested quietly. But even as they stood to retreat into the house, the truck's headlights swept across their yard, and David saw something that made his blood run cold. The vehicle was the right size and color, but the license plate was wrong, and there were too many people silhouetted in the cab for a routine patrol. Vincent Carrera was in prison, his organization dismantled, his threat eliminated. But criminal enterprises had a way of regenerating like weeds, sending up new shoots even after the main structure had been cut down. "Inside," David said urgently. "Now." But as they hurried toward the door with Scout at their heels, David realized that their peaceful interlude was over. Someone had found David Morrison and Ellen Morrison, which meant their carefully constructed new lives were about to face the same test that had destroyed their old ones. The only question was whether they had learned enough from their previous experiences to survive what was coming next. The apple tree sapling that David had planted just that morning stood barely 3 feet tall in the corner of their new orchard, its tender branches vulnerable to any harsh wind that might blow through the valley. But its roots, grafted onto hardy mountain stock, ran deep into soil that would nourish it through whatever storms lay ahead. As the suspicious truck drew closer to their farmhouse, David found himself thinking about that sapling and what it represented new life carefully, grafted onto proven foundations, something beautiful and productive, growing from the careful combination of different strengths. "Get the emergency bag," he told Ellen as they reached the safety of their kitchen. Same drill as before. She nodded and disappeared toward the bedroom, where they kept a go bag packed with cash, identification documents, and everything they would need to disappear again if their new identities were compromised. 3 months of peaceful farming hadn't made them careless about security. If anything, having something precious to protect had made them more vigilant about potential threats. But as David watched the truck through their kitchen window, something about its approach seemed wrong for an attack. The vehicle was moving slowly, deliberately, like someone who was uncertain about their destination rather than confident about their mission. Scout whined softly and pressed against David's leg. The dog's instincts conflicted between alertness and confusion. His body language suggested concern rather than the aggressive protectiveness he'd shown when Carrera's men had approached their Montana ranch. The truck stopped 50 yards from the house, far enough away to avoid seeming threatening, but close enough for conversation. After a moment, a single figure emerged from the driver's side with hands clearly visible and empty. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was female, older, carrying the careful politeness of someone trying not to cause alarm. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I'm looking for Ellen Morrison." Ellen appeared beside David at the window, her emergency bag in hand, but her expression puzzled rather than fearful. "I know that voice," she said slowly. "Mrs. Patterson from the feed store. But what's she doing here so late?" The woman in their yard was indeed Carol Patterson, who ran the agricultural supply business where they purchased feed and equipment for their small operation. She was in her 60s, with the practical demeanor of someone who had spent her life helping farmers solve problems, both large and small. "Mrs. Patterson?" Ellen called through the window. "Is everything all right?" "Oh, thank goodness you're home," Carol replied with obvious relief. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been an accident on Highway 18. Bad one? Involving the Hendricks family from up the valley. The hospital called looking for someone to take care of their animals until they can get back on their feet." David felt his tension ease as the situation clarified itself. This wasn't an attack or a threat to their security. It was the kind of community crisis that brought rural neighbors together in mutual support. "What kind of accident?" Ellen asked as she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Head-on collision with a drunk driver about 2 hours ago. Bob Hendricks is in surgery. His wife has a broken leg, and their teenage daughter has a concussion. They'll all recover, but it's going to be weeks before they can handle farm chores." The Hendricks family ran a small dairy operation 15 miles up the valley, the kind of marginal enterprise that required constant attention to remain viable. A few weeks of neglect could destroy years of careful breeding and herd development. "They've got 40 head of dairy cattle that need milking twice a day," Carol continued, "plus chickens, pigs, and a couple of horses. The sheriff's been calling around looking for someone who could help out temporarily." "Why us?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. Their successful integration into the farming community had marked them as reliable neighbors, the kind of people who could be trusted with someone else's livelihood. "Because you two are the only folks in the valley with both the skills and the availability to handle a job this size. Everyone else is either too old, too busy, or doesn't know enough about dairy operations to keep the herd healthy." Ellen looked at David with raised eyebrows, and he could see her working through the implications. Taking responsibility for the Hendricks farm would mean daily trips to another property, increased visibility in the community, and the kind of public recognition that their federal protection handlers had warned them to avoid. But it would also demonstrate their commitment to their new community in ways that mere attendance at social functions couldn't match. Helping neighbors in crisis was the fastest way to transform from outsiders to integral members of the local support network. "We'll do it," Ellen said before David could voice his security concerns. "How soon can you take us over there to assess the situation?" "Right now, if you're willing. The evening milking is already 3 hours overdue, and those cows are getting uncomfortable. David weighed the risks against the benefits and made a decision that surprised him with its ease. For 3 months, they had lived carefully, avoiding attention and maintaining the low profile that federal agents had recommended. But watching Carol Patterson's relief at their acceptance reminded him that sometimes the best way to hide was to become indispensable to the people around you. "Give us 10 minutes to grab some supplies," he said. "We'll follow you over there." As Carol's truck disappeared back down their driveway, Ellen turned to David with a smile that reminded him of the woman who had once coaxed music from a dust-covered pump organ. "Second thoughts?" she asked. "None at all. Sometimes the best way to build a new life is to help other people preserve theirs." The Hendricks farm was smaller than their own operation, but more intensive, with facilities that reflected 3 generations of gradual improvement and expansion. The dairy barn was modern and well-maintained, with automated systems that simplified the milking process, but still required human oversight to function properly. 43 cows, David reported after completing his initial survey. Good condition, overall, though they're definitely stressed from the delayed milking. We'll need to get them back on schedule gradually to avoid disrupting their production. Ellen was examining the chicken coops and pig pens, noting feed supplies and water systems with the practiced eye of someone who understood that animals depended entirely on human reliability for their welfare. "Everything's well organized," she called from across the farmyard. "Clear labeling, good record keeping, enough feed for about 2 weeks if we're careful. The Hendricks know what they're doing." They worked through the night, learning the rhythms and requirements of someone else's operation, while the animals gradually adjusted to their unfamiliar caretakers. Scout proved invaluable, his herding instincts helping to move cattle, and his gentle presence calming livestock that were already stressed by the disruption to their routine. By dawn, they had completed the morning milking and established a temporary schedule that would maintain the herd's health and productivity until the family could return. But more importantly, they had crossed a threshold in their new lives, moving from careful observers to active participants in their community's welfare. "The sheriff wants to talk to you," Carl Patterson said when she returned to check on their progress. "Nothing official, just wanted to thank you personally for stepping up when everyone else was already stretched thin." Sheriff Mike Kowalski was younger than David had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the steady demeanor of someone who took his responsibilities seriously without taking himself too seriously. He found them finishing the morning chores, their clothes dirty, and their faces tired but satisfied. "I hear you folks saved the day," he said without preamble. "Bob Hendricks has been worried sick about his herd, even with everything else going on. Knowing his animals are in good hands is the only thing that's letting him focus on getting better. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Ellen replied with a kind of modest deflection that made people trust her instinctively. "Well, this neighbor appreciates it more than you know. We don't get a lot of folks willing to take on this kind of responsibility, especially people who are still establishing their own operations." The sheriff's gratitude was genuine, but David could also sense evaluation behind his words. Law enforcement officers developed instincts about people that went beyond simple background checks, and Kowalski was clearly trying to get a better read on the newcomers who had so readily volunteered for a difficult task. "How long have you been farming?" the sheriff asked conversationally. "All our lives, one way or another," David replied truthfully. "Cattle mostly, though Ellen's got more experience with mixed operations than I do. Where did you farm before coming here?" The question was casual, but David recognized it as the kind of probe that could lead to complications if not handled carefully. Their cover story would withstand official scrutiny, but detailed conversation with an experienced law enforcement officer required a delicate balance between honesty and misdirection. "Montana, mostly," Ellen said, stepping into the conversation with practiced ease. "Lost our place in a fire last year. Insurance covered the debts, but starting over at our age seemed like too much work." Then we heard about the Peterson place being available and decided Oregon might be a good place for a fresh start. It was the truth, carefully edited to remove the elements that would raise questions about Vincent Carrera and federal witness protection. The sheriff nodded with understanding. Rural communities were full of people who had been forced by circumstances to start over somewhere new. "Fire's a hell of a thing," he said sympathetically. "Lost everything, did you?" "Everything that mattered at the time," David replied. "But we've learned that sometimes losing what you think you can't live without makes room for things that matter more." As if to emphasize his point, Scout chose that moment to emerge from the dairy barn with a newborn calf following uncertainly behind him. The dog had apparently discovered that one of the cows had calved during the night, and his careful shepherding was guiding the baby toward its mother. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Kowalski said with genuine admiration. "That dog's got better instincts than most cowboys I know. Where'd you find him?" "He found us," Ellen said, scratching Scout behind the ears as he completed his self-appointed mission. Sometimes the best things in life just show up when you need them most. The sheriff stayed long enough to help with the afternoon milking, working alongside them with the easy competence of someone who had grown up around livestock. By the time he left, David sensed that their status in the community had shifted from newcomers under observation to neighbors who had proven there. "Worth, you think he suspects anything?" Ellen asked as they drove home in the gathering dusk. "I think he's satisfied that we're exactly who we appear to be, experienced farmers who came here for a fresh start and aren't afraid of hard work." David glanced at Scout, who was sleeping contentedly in the back seat. The fact that we dropped everything to help the Hendricks probably answered more questions than any background check could. That evening, as they sat on their porch and planned the schedule that would allow them to maintain both farms until the family recovered, David found himself thinking again about the apple tree sapling they had planted that morning. It would take years before the tree produced fruit, but the foundation for future harvests was already being established. Their new life was like that sapling, vulnerable in some ways, but rooted in soil that would nourish whatever they chose to grow. The crisis with the Hendricks farm had tested their commitment to their community and their willingness to risk exposure for the sake of others. They had passed that test, which meant they were no longer hiding in Oregon, but truly living there. The difference, David was beginning to understand, was more important than he had imagined possible when they first arrived as David and Ellen Morrison, as Scout settled at their feet and the barn bell chimed softly in the evening breeze. David, Morrison and Ellen Morrison, who had once been other people in another place, contemplated the future they were building one careful choice at a time. The apple tree sapling stood in the darkness beyond their porch, barely visible but unmistakably present, its roots already beginning to explore the rich Oregon soil that would sustain it through whatever seasons lay ahead, tomorrow would bring. Another early morning at the Hendricks farm, another day of proving that some transformations were worth whatever they cost. But tonight was for sitting together in the peace they had earned, holding hands and listening to the sound of their new life taking root in ground that had proven fertile beyond their most optimistic expectations. 5 years had passed since the night that David and Ellen Morrison had helped save the Hendricks dairy farm, and the apple orchard behind their house now bore fruit that was the pride of the county farmers market. The trees that had started as vulnerable saplings grafted onto hardy root stock had grown into a productive grove that supplied both fresh fruit and the cider the cheese had become their signature contribution to community events. The new family portrait sat on the mantelpiece of their rebuilt home, showing David and Ellen standing among the apple trees in full bloom, with Scout now graying around the muzzle, but still energetic, sitting proudly between them. But the most significant addition to the photograph was barely visible, Ellen's hand resting on her rounded belly, where their first child was due to arrive before the next harvest season. "Dr. Martinez is here," Ellen called from the kitchen. using the name their old FBI contact had adopted since leaving federal service to join a victims' advocacy organization. Sandra Martinez had become a regular visitor over the years, officially checking on their welfare, but increasingly coming simply as a friend who understood the unique challenges of building new lives from the ashes of old ones. David emerged from the orchard where he'd been checking the last of the season's apples, his hands stained with the honest dirt of work that fed both body and soul. At 69, he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. But his eyes held a contentment that had been absent during his years as Everett Sloan. "How's the expectant father feeling?" Martinez asked with the easy familiarity of someone who had watched their transformation from traumatized survivors to thriving members of their community. "Terrified and grateful in equal measure," David admitted. "Ellen keeps reminding me that people have been having babies for thousands of years without detailed instruction manuals. But I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong." "That's what makes you a good father already," Martinez observed. "The ones who don't worry are usually the ones who should." Ellen appeared from the kitchen, carrying a pitcher of their famous apple cider and glasses for everyone. At 35, pregnancy had given her a glow that complemented the confidence she'd developed over their years in Oregon. The fearful woman who had once hidden in barns and run from debt collectors had evolved into someone who served on the school board and organized disaster relief efforts for neighboring counties. "Any word from the old neighborhood?" she asked, as they settled on the porch that David had rebuilt to match the one from his Montana ranch, complete with a swing that Scout had claimed as his personal territory. "Vincent Carrera died in prison last month," Martinez reported matter-of-factly. "Lung cancer. His organization never recovered from the prosecutions. Most of his lieutenants are still serving time, and the ones who got out went into different lines of work." The news should have felt like closure, but David found that the man who had once threatened their lives now seemed like a figure from ancient history rather than a source of ongoing concern. Their new life had grown so complete, so satisfying, that the old dangers felt like stories about other people. "What about Tommy's records?" Ellen asked. "Are they still helping with prosecutions?" "A gift that keeps on giving. Federal prosecutors have used his documentation in 17 separate cases over the past 5 years. Your husband's final act probably prevented more crimes than a dozen traditional law enforcement operations." Ellen's hand moved unconsciously to the chain around her neck, where she still wore Tommy's wedding ring alongside the new one that David had given her 3 years ago, during a ceremony in the little church where they'd become pillars of the congregation. She had never forgotten her first husband, but she no longer carried his failures as her own burden. "Speaking of gifts," Martinez continued, reaching into her briefcase to withdraw an official-looking envelope. "This came through federal channels, but it's addressed to you personally." The letter was from Bob Hendricks, written from the assisted living facility where he'd moved after his wife's death the previous winter. His dairy farm had been sold to developers, but he'd requested that the proceeds be used to establish a scholarship fund for young people who wanted to study agriculture. "He wants you two to serve on the selection committee," Martinez explained. "Says the community trusts your judgment about who has both the skills and the character to succeed in farming." David and Ellen exchanged glances that contained entire conversations developed over years of partnership. Serving on the scholarship committee would mean more public visibility, more opportunities for their past to potentially catch up with them. But it would also mean helping young people achieve dreams that might otherwise remain forever out of reach. "We'll do it," Ellen said without hesitation. "Bob Hendricks gave us our first real chance to prove ourselves in this community. The least we can do is help him keep that tradition alive." Scout stirred from his nap and stretched, before wandering over to investigate the interesting scents that Martinez had brought from the outside world. At 10 years old, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his devotion to his humans remained absolute. "How is the pregnancy going?" Martinez asked, noting the way Ellen unconsciously cradled her belly when she thought no one was looking. Better than I expected. The doctor says everything looks normal, though at my age, normal requires more monitoring than it used to. She smiled with the particular radiance that came from unexpected second chances. David's more nervous than I am. He's already started building a crib that could survive a tornado. After losing one family, I'm not taking any chances with this one, David said simply. This baby is going to have every advantage I can provide, starting with furniture that will last for generations. The sun was setting behind the hills that had sheltered their new life, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded David of evening rides across Montana pastures that now existed only in memory. But where those memories had once brought only pain, they now carried a bittersweet appreciation for how much joy could emerge from the deepest grief. Any regrets? Martinez asked, the question that had become a tradition during her visits. About which part? Ellen responded. Running away from my old life, accepting help from a stranger, burning down a house, living under assumed names, or moving 500 miles to start over in a place where nobody knew our history? Any of it, all of it. David considered the question as he watched their neighbors, the Wilson family, driving their cattle toward the barn for evening milking. The Wilsons were in their 30s with young children, and they had sought David's advice about expanding their operation to include fruit trees. In 2 weeks, he would help them plant their first apple saplings using techniques he and Ellen had perfected through years of patient experimentation. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, he said finally. The violence, the fear, the years we both spent running from threats, they should never have existed. But I don't regret the choices we made once we found each other. Even losing everything you'd built before? Buildings can be replaced. Land can be bought somewhere else. But finding someone who shares your values and wants to build something beautiful together, that's irreplaceable. Ellen reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Besides, we didn't lose everything. We kept the parts that mattered most and left behind the parts that were holding us back. Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen enough trauma to appreciate genuine healing when she encountered it. What about when the baby comes? Any concerns about explaining your history? We'll tell the truth, adjusted for age-appropriate understanding, Ellen said. That we're people who made mistakes, faced consequences, and chose to learn from what happened rather than being destroyed by it. That sometimes starting over is the bravest thing you can do. As if responding to the mention of new life, Scout suddenly perked up and trotted toward the apple orchard, his tail wagging with excitement. Following his gaze, they saw a doe and her twin fawns emerging from the trees to graze in the evening. Light, completely unafraid of the humans watching from the porch. They come every evening, David explained to Martinez. Scout figured out months ago that they're not a threat, so now he just enjoys watching them. Sometimes I think he sees them as part of his responsibility, more lives to keep safe on his territory. The deer grazed peacefully among the apple trees, their presence a daily reminder that the orchard they'd planted was becoming part of the natural ecosystem rather than an intrusion upon it. Like their new identities, the trees had put down roots, so deep and spread so wide that they were now indistinguishable from the landscape that surrounded them. Any final thoughts for my report? Martinez asked as she prepared to leave. Her official visits were less frequent now, but she still filed periodic assessments about the success of their relocation and integration. Tell them it worked, Ellen said simply. Tell them that sometimes the best way to hide people isn't to make them invisible, but to help them become so valuable to their community that everyone wants to protect them. And tell them, David added, that the program's real success isn't measured by how well people disappear, but by how completely they're able to reappear as the people they were meant to be all along. After Martinez left, David and Ellen remained on the porch as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Scout had returned from his deer-watching expedition and resumed his position on the swing, his rhythmic breathing adding to the peaceful sounds of evening in the country. "Do you think our child will want to know about Everett Sloan and Lila Morgan?" Ellen asked quietly. "Someday, probably. Children have a way of sensing when their parents are keeping important secrets." David considered the question seriously. But by then, hopefully, those people will feel like characters in a story rather than identities we're hiding from. A story with a happy ending. The happiest ending I can imagine. Ellen's hand moved to her belly, where their child was growing, strong in the safety and love they'd built together. In 7 months, there would be 3 of them sitting on this porch, watching the deer graze among apple trees that bore fruit because 2 people had decided that some chances were worth taking, regardless of the risks involved. The barn bell chimed softly in the evening breeze, marking the end of another day in lives that had been grafted together from the broken pieces of what came before. But like the apple trees that now fed their community, what they'd created was stronger and more productive than either of them could have achieved alone. Tomorrow would bring more work in the orchard, more participation in community events, more careful tending of the new life growing both inside Ellen and around their farm. But tonight was for holding hands on their porch, listening to Scout's contented snoring, and feeling grateful for the chain of events that had brought them together. The photograph on their mantelpiece captured a moment of perfect happiness. But the real joy lay in knowing that it represented not just where they'd arrived, but the foundation for whatever they chose to build next. They had learned that some transformations were worth any price, and that the most beautiful fruit often grew from the most carefully grafted roots got in the darkness beyond their porch. The apple trees stood ready for whatever seasons lay ahead, their branches reaching toward stars that shone down a family that had proven it was possible to start over, no matter how broken things seemed at the beginning. And Scout, their faithful guardian and witness to every stage of their journey, dreamed dog dreams that probably included endless fields of grass, herds of gentle cattle, and the certainty that his humans would always be there when he woke up. Story that had begun with blood and fear and a desperate flight through the night had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of choosing hope over despair, community over isolation, and love over the safer but emptier alternative of protecting oneself from any possibility of future loss. David Morrison and Ellen Morrison, who had once been other people in another place, fell asleep that night in each other's arms, dreaming of apple harvests and children's laughter and all the beautiful ordinariness that came from deciding to build a life worth living, one careful choice at a time.